So welcome to our second discussion of Plato's Symposium. I'm going to start with something not directly in the text, which is that there's two decent commentaries on the Greek text by English-speaking authors. One is a guy called Kenneth Dover, who's a great Aristophanes scholar. And in the preface to his commentary on the Symposium, he says, "I do not find his philosophical arguments even marginally persuasive." And the problem with that is, if you despise the object of your editorialship, you will not tend to search to try and understand what it is you're reading. And so further on he says, "Another consequence of this problem that Plato is taken seriously by fools is that the Platonic Socrates is taken in all seriousness as if he were a man with a genuinely open and inquiring mind. And the quality of other Greek intellectuals, some of whom are best known to us through Plato's portrayal of them, is underrated." In all seriousness. That's very funny. And so he knows Greek very, very well, because he's edited several Aristophanes plays and so on. But he misunderstands some very basic things, and it affects his understanding of the syntax because he doesn't think there's any need to search very far. This is just Plato being slipshod, or yeah. And there's the other good. It's still a helpful commentary. And the other one is by R.G. Berry from 1930. So that was 1965. And it's also a helpful commentary. But I'm going to read a passage later when we get to a problem in Phaedrus' speech. And it just, reading these commentaries can benefit you, but our whole intellectual tradition has been in a process of detachment from its highest figures that began sometime in the 19th century, you could say, with the rise of historicism, and rapidly accelerated especially after the First World War. And that's why, but what I want to do is to try and bring us as close back just to the look at the text and see what's there, under the impression that there might be something worthy of study. And I think there is. For example, Phaedrus' speech, the first speech contains an evocation of how to understand human beings as being fundamentally driven by selfishness and utility, the desire for utility. And it contains an unintentional critique of that view, as if Plato can see something, a fundamental question, and he can see a potential answer along Hobbesian or Lockean lines and show the problem with it. I think that he has that kind of breadth of vision. Now, I want to read some passages from the opening scene, especially between Aristodemus and Socrates, and then at the beginning of the Symposium, and then we'll get on to Phaedrus' speech. I'm just going to share the handout because there's a couple of passages we need to read first in order to understand those passages. So, I've also got the corrected schedule. Now, I've tried to restrict myself to two long quotations from Greek poems because they're both quoted incorrectly. Plato very, very rarely cites a poet in the same form as our best editions. And the editors will often change the edition, saying, well, Plato had a better edition than we do, because our editions are at the earliest from 895. That's our best edition of Plato. It's at Oxford, right? And Plato had an edition from 380 BC, but he's deliberately making changes as a commentary on what he thinks of the poet. So that's a foolish exercise. It's hilarious what people do. But so first of all, this is a statement from a dialogue called the Phaedrus, which is about what poetry is. And in the Phaedrus, which is the first person to give a speech on Eros in the Symposium, is Phaedrus. And there's a separate dialogue which is about eros, and, well, it's about erotic speeches. And you can see that combination of interest in Phaedrus. He's the reason that we're talking about eros, or making speeches about eros. But he himself is not erotic, as we'll see. So in that dialogue, Socrates defends madness. He says madness has 4 kinds, and the third kind is poetic inspiration. And he describes it as follows: the third possession and madness comes from the Muses, which takes hold of a delicate and pure soul. And he uses the same word delicate that Agathon, who is a poet, will use of souls later on. It just to point that. So the third kind of madness comes from the Muses, and it comes to a delicate, a soft and untrodden soul, rousing and exciting it to Bacchic frenzy in both songs and the rest of poetry. And by adorning or setting in order a myriad of deeds of the ancients, it educates those who come after. So, and that's not just a definition of poetic inspiration. It's the normal understanding and the permanent understanding of what education is. Education is a poetic or literary exercise. We now say narrative, right? The person who controls our understanding of things controls the narrative. Science is always subordinate to that narrative, even when pretending to follow the science is the main key in your narrative, right? Because you're not reading the papers. Who was that guy? Heinrich Sutton, or Adolf Sutton, or Brett Goebbels. I forget his name. Brett Sutton, that's it. I don't know why I made that mistake. Brett Sutton. He's not reading the papers. He's not reading the Lancet. He just produces the press release and so on. So, even when science is used rhetorically, and for us, it's the authority, so we use it authoritatively because there's a narrative around it that it's brought us all these benefits, and it's the authoritative understanding of things. So I'm not criticizing science. I'm just saying that it and everything else has a subordinate position to those things that we adorn and set in order. So that he uses this funny word cosmousa, cosmane, from which we get cosmos. A cosmos is a beautiful order. But is the beauty of the order because it's been adorned, or is there a beautiful order that's beautiful before we look upon it? Right? Now the poets make it a beautiful order, and they make these beautiful gods who live forever and so on. Right? Now we construct our narrative differently, with focus groups, policy think tanks, and so on, but it's still a construction of a narrative in order to have massive political persuasiveness. Okay, so that's a very brief description of poetry and education and their priority to the power of science. Right? And we'll see that exactly the same thing in the beginning of the Symposium, because Eric Symmachus, who represents science, he's a doctor who represents science in the dialogue, and his speech is about science. It's about science as superior to eros, and he, when he makes the proposal that they talk about eros instead of drinking, he checks with everyone first, especially Agathon, and that's meant to represent the political stature of science. It depends upon the narrative, the political power. As Aristotle says in the beginning of the Ethics, it's the political power that sets down who will learn what sciences and to what degree. I think that remains true, and the political power is not itself a science. Okay. So, brief description of poetry from Plato's point of view. Now, there's two quotes that I've translated the context of. One is at the beginning of Aristodemus's. So I'm just going to have to stop sharing for a moment. I'll just write a couple of things on the board. So I'm just going to pin myself, thanks to Peter's kind reminder. So is that showing this? So the dialogue begins with Apollodorus and these multiple unnamed companions, only one of whom speaks, and we are in the position of the unnamed companion. We are receiving this filtered, modified, semi-forgotten story through Apollodorus, who's a kind of fanatic. When Apollodorus describes Aristodemus, he says he was the one who was most of all a lover of Socrates, of people then. The implication being, not now, that's me now, right? And that's important in Phaedrus' speech, because Phaedrus discusses lovers as if they're driven by shame and emulation, but the emulation is competition. And he has to downplay that. And that's Duncan, who's downstairs. Thanks. Hi, Duncan. Great, someone's coming right now. Thanks. Bye. Okay, so then Apollodorus relates what he heard from Aristodemus, who met with Socrates. They turn up at Agathon's place and they encounter a couple of slaves. I'm using this harsh word because they're not just servants, and that becomes important later too. And they meet Agathon, Phaedrus, Pausanias, Eryximachus, Aristophanes, and in the end, Alcibiades. Breaks in. Now, when they first get there, I'm just going to put all this on the board once and for all, and then we can just discuss without having to jump up and down all the time. So when they get there, Pausanias says, we drank so much yesterday, I prefer that we didn't drink so much today. He's hungover. And Aristophanes backs him up, and then the doctor says, I need to test the water first before I make any kind of decision. So he asks Agathon how he feels, and Agathon says, I'd too like to back it off a little bit. And then Eryximachus, the doctor, says, well, if you guys who are most powerful at drinking don't want to drink so much, then that's a benefit for the rest of us. So that tells us, and he mentions Aristodemus. So there are three kinds of drinker, right? There's Aristodemus, weak. Eryximachus, also weak. Socrates is in his own category, right? So he's exceptional. He can drink or not, and it has no effect, as he proves in the Symposium by drinking all night and then putting to bed everyone else and going off and going about his day. Right? Agathon is a strong drinker. Phaedrus is weak. Pausanias is strong. And Aristophanes is strong. And I'm assuming that we put Alcibiades amongst the strong drinkers. And then another distinction that's made is whether or not people are lovers or not. Right, so Aristodemus, he's described explicitly as a lover of Socrates, right? So therefore that makes Socrates a beloved. Agathon is also a beloved, young, beautiful, talented. Phaedrus is young, beautiful, less talented, and he's the beloved of Eryximachus, who's his older lover. Pausanias is the older lover of Agathon. Aristophanes, not said to be a lover or a beloved. Alcibiades reveals that, in a sense, he's another lover of Socrates. So Socrates has more, including Apollodorus, in this dialogue. Okay, and these distinctions are meaningful because the original notion of eros is the upper class eros of an older man and a younger man. That immediately gets changed in the first speech. And by the time we reach Socrates, we're talking about human beings of all kinds. But that's where it starts. And that's just another example of Plato's dictum, that you start with opinion and transcend it. And it has within itself a self-understanding that transcends the original opinion that you begin with. And yeah, and that's exhibited in each of the speakers, because they each try and make a complete statement that, when you examine it, transcends their understanding of it. They reveal more of themselves than they want to. Okay, so I don't know how to unpin. I'm going to go back to the handout. Okay, now when Aristodemus meets Socrates, Socrates is uncharacteristically washed and shod, and made himself nice. Aristodemus, though, is in his normal condition, no shoes, unwashed. And Socrates takes him, says, "Why don't you come uninvited to this symposium?" And he says, because with two going together is better than one. And he quotes from Homer, and I've just got a slightly more of this quotation of Homer, which I'll read. And the context is that night has fallen. Hector has almost wiped out the Greeks. Hector, the great Trojan hero, and the Trojan army and Hector are out in the field, and the Greeks need to know what's their disposition. Are they well guarded? Could we perhaps commit a surprise attack against them? Are they about to wipe us out? Are they about to attack, and so on? So Nestor, the elder statesman and somewhat gregarious human being, asks for volunteers amongst the Greek kings to go and spy on the Trojans. And the next passage is, so he spoke, so Nestor spoke, but they were all silent. So no one feels particularly suicidal about going into the enemy camp. But good Diomedes of the war cry addressed them. Nestor, my heart and proud spirit. And it's a word thumos that Homer uses quite frequently, and that wasn't used a lot after that until Plato picked it up and made it central to the understanding of the human psyche in the Republic. My heart and proud spirit rouse me to enter into the army of these enemies who are near us, the Trojans. But if some other man too would follow me, there will be more comfort and confidence. And with two going together, one of the two understands beforehand in which way it's profitable. That is, someone can pick out what is best to do, and he uses a word that is usually associated with profit. So you could translate it, what's better, but I particularly want to use the word profitable. But alone, even if he understands, his mind is smaller and his wit's weaker. So the context for this saying that Socrates uses with Aristodemus is they are spies going into the camp of the enemy. So the enemy camp is characterized by at least two main aspects. One, poetry. It's Agathon's house, tragic poet. And the two, in general, sophistry. And all of these people, Phaedrus is a student of sophists, as we'll see shortly. Eryximachus represents the new cosmology that comes with what we now call pre-Socratic philosophy, which is the cosmology of the sophists like Protagoras and so on. So Protagoras, who was the most famous sophist, and he made a lot of money going around Greece selling his intellectual products, actually has a dialogue dedicated to him by Plato. And in that dialogue, everyone who's here is in that dialogue. Agathon, Aristophanes, Phaedrus, Eryximachus. Sorry, Aristophanes is not, because Aristophanes doesn't approve of what was then the modern sophistry. So Aristophanes, who is just as radical as everyone else, his extremely daring comedies have a conservative, to use a very general term, have a conservative intent. He wants people to return to the laws and practices of the tradition, using innovative speech, which is itself a difficulty. Okay, so they're going into the house of the enemy camp, right? And you would have heard this famous phrase that there's an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. So we're getting that contest, and that becomes very explicit when Socrates speaks to Agathon, and we're going to read that passage in a moment. Now, in Phaedrus' speech, Phaedrus starts with a cosmological view, which is a mix of Hesiod and Parmenides. So a pre-Socratic philosopher for whom, if the gods exist, they're not the gods of the city. And Hesiod, who is one of the two founders for the Greeks of their gods. So they're mixed together. And he does that by eliminating Hesiod's references to the gods. So this is, I've put in just a few lines from Hesiod's theogony. Theogony means the birth of the gods. Theon, goner, the birth of the gods. And I'll just read this, and then we can go, and then from then on we'll just look at the text. But I think these things are helpful to understand. So the first line of Hesiod's theogony is, "Let us begin to sing from the Heliconian muses, who are themselves goddesses." And after an introduction, he says, and this story, mythos, so narrative, right? Hesiod is one of the two most important people for producing what we would call the narrative of the Greeks. Their poetic, their understanding of the cosmos, which has been cosmane, adorned. Right? This story, this narrative, the goddesses first told me. The Olympian muses, the daughters of Aegis bearing Zeus, and this is what they say to him: field-dwelling shepherds, vicious disgraces, mere bellies. We know how to say many false things like the genuine or the true, and we know, whenever we wish, to proclaim the true things. So our access to the truth is mediated by a divine source that explicitly says that it will speak falsely and possibly speak truly. So there's an essential hermeneutical role to invoke the god Hermes for human beings. Okay, so he goes on, and they breathed an inspired voice into me so that I might make famous what will be and what has been, and they ordered me to hymn the blessed ones, that's in the singular, it should be plural, the blessed ones who always are, that is the gods, but to sing of themselves, that is the muses, first and last. Okay, so after more introduction, he then begins the theogony proper, the birth of the gods proper, as follows. Indeed, first of all, chaos came to be. And the word chaos does not mean, translators now will say something like chasm or gap. There's an absence rather than like an aggregated mass of unformed matter. It's more of an absence. That's the current understanding. But chaos. And it came to be. Now, how did it come to be? Don't you need something to come from something else? How could a gap come to be? Open question, right? Then he says, so then thereafter, broad-breasted earth, always the safe seat of all the immortals who have the snowy peak of Olympus and shady Tartarus in the depths of broad-wayed earth. And Eros. So first of all, chaos, then earth and Eros. And that's what Phaedrus is going to isolate. And he's going to leave out this stuff about Tartarus, a kind of hell, right? And Olympus, a kind of heaven. He's going to leave that out because he's an atheist, right? Eros, who is most beautiful among the immortal gods, the limb loosener, and all gods and human beings, he overpowers their intellect and thoughtful counsel in their breast. From chaos, Erebus and Black Night came to be. And we have this same word, this come to be, which is related to our word Genesis, coming into being. Right? But that's different from generation. So there's somehow a background process of Genesis, becoming, that involves earth, night, and so on. prior to Eros. Only after you have Eros do you have generation. From Eros, from chaos, Eros, Erebus and black night came to be, and then ether and day were born from night. And now we have Eros, and now we can have generation or birth. Whom, that is ether and day, he, that is night, gave birth to, and that's a normal word for giving birth, after mingling with affection with Erebus.
Erebus.
Yeah, so night slept with Erebus and gave birth to ether and day. Okay, but that's just a bit of background.
Who's Erebus?
He's a bit like night. He's very dark. Okay.
Wait, why are we reading Homer?
Because that's quoted by Socrates. And I need to figure out how to turn a page around. There it is. Okay, is that text visible?
It's very small.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that line is at 174D, which is the right-hand side of this page, where he says, with the two of us going on the way together, we shall deliberate on what we shall say. Right? Now he's saying, what we'll say about you coming uninvited. But then Socrates holds back and deliberates about something, and Aristodemus goes up and is embarrassed to be discovered at the door of the Agathon's house, because he's immediately taken in the middle of when they're having dinner. And Agathon, who is on the one hand extremely urbane and apparently gracious, right? And he says, over the page, so we're at 174D, at the very top of page 4 of this translation, he says, Aristodemus, you have come at a fine time to share a dinner. If you have come for something else, put it off for another time, as I was looking for you yesterday to invite you but could not find you. Just straightforwardly a lie, right? He didn't want this guy, he hasn't even washed, to come into the house, but he's being polite. And it's not just because he's urbane, it's because of the next line. But how is it that you are not bringing our Socrates? Right? He knows that this guy, who is a disciple of Socrates, a fanatic, follower, should have Socrates with him. Okay, so Aristodemus finds that Socrates is nowhere in sight, and they seat him down, and he protects Socrates from Agathon sending for him constantly for a while, and then Socrates comes in. This starts at 175C, and after this he said they dined. But Socrates did not come in, and though Agathon often ordered that Socrates be sent for, Aristodemus did not permit it. Then Socrates did come in. He had lingered as long as was usual for him, when they were just about in the middle of dinner. Then he said that Agathon, who happened to be lying down at the far end alone, said, Here, Socrates, lie down alongside me, so that by my touching you, I too may enjoy the piece of wisdom that just occurred to you while you were in the porch. He turned off to the neighbour's porch, colonnade, and stood there for a while. It is plain that you found it and have it, for otherwise you would not have come away beforehand. Now, Agathon is beautiful, right, and famous, and he's just experienced the peak of fame at about the age of 30. Won first prize with his tragedy. So he's been on a stage before 10,000 Greeks, mixed audience, men and women, and fame, like beauty, is attractive. It is attraction, right? It's a source of attraction, and whether or not this is entirely deceptive, it gives you the impression that you consummate that attraction by touch, by a proximity. Right? That he actually says here to Socrates that if you've just discovered some thought, I can receive it via touch, which sounds strange, okay? But that's got something to do with the attraction of what's beautiful, which can lead to the desire to touch it. Now, and Socrates sat down and said, it would be a good thing, Agathon, if wisdom were the sort of thing that flows from the fuller of us into the emptier, just by our touching one another, as the water in wine cups flows through a wool thread from the fuller to the emptier. Now, he's not just referring to a scientific experiment with cups of wine, which you can all try at home. He's also making a somewhat coarse sexual illusion. And then he says, for if wisdom too is like that, then I set a high price on my being placed alongside you. But wisdom is not like that, so he doesn't set a high price on him. For I believe I will be filled from you with much beautiful wisdom. Beautiful wisdom. And what does he mean by that? He means wisdom that appears beautiful to many people. This becomes very explicit later on when Agathon gives his speech. And Socrates interrogates him about how he felt being on stage before 10,000 Greeks. We'll see what happens then. But it's by beautiful wisdom, he means that which appears beautiful to other people. Now, my own wisdom, this is Socrates on his own account, my own wisdom may turn out to be a sorry sort of wisdom, or disputable like a dream. It's a dream because it depends upon certain assumptions about how things are. It's not something that, what he repudiates is the notion that you can have a science of the whole. You cannot have a fully scientific comprehension of everything on the model of mathematics for many different kinds of reasons. And it depends upon certain assumptions, which is why he's always in dialogue, because he's in dialogue in order to elicit certain assumptions and build from there. And so, which means that opinion is the basis for the transcendence of opinion, as I was mentioning before. So it's as transient, well, not as transient, but it's disputable as a dream because it's not, it's not built on conceptual foundations that are argued to be true and so on. Now that's different, and he often calls other people's understanding a dream, but they don't know they're dreaming. And he implies, and this is in the Republic especially, that people take an image, doxa, an opinion, for the truth, and that's to be living in a dream. But he's comparing his own wisdom to a dream because it too depends upon unprovable assumptions. Okay. But your own wisdom is brilliant and capable of much development, since it has flashed out so intensely from you while you were young. And yesterday it became conspicuous among more than 30,000 Greek witnesses. Okay, so his fame has the reality that comes from being beautiful to many people, which will receive a criticism later on. Now Agathon says, you are outrageous, hubristic. Hubristic is a very serious charge. It can be like here, which is almost a flippant conversational thing, but the crime of hubris can be related to impiety or what we will call sexual assault. Because only someone of incredible arrogance commits that kind of crime in either case, right? Now, Socrates is being accused of being hubristic by a poet, and then he follows that by saying, a little later, you and I will go to court. So go to court, we will seek judgment about wisdom, right? With Dionysus as the judge. But now first attend to dinner. Now, the god Dionysus won't appear in the dialogue, but the young general Alcibiades will, and he's wearing some laurels, he's been out drinking. Now, where he's been out drinking, we don't know, but this is the background to this dialogue is an act of impiety that occurred around this time that came out a year later and led to many of the people in this dialogue being accused of profaning the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, and of defacing the Hermes, of one or both of these crimes. So, and Eryximachus was charged and put to death. Phaedrus was charged and fled. Alcibiades was charged and fled to the Spartans. And so the dialogue, with that accusation of hubris, the setting of the dialogue at a private drinking party is at a time when this crime was committed, associates it with that crime. So maybe Dionysus was out profaning the mysteries or damaging the Hermes before he turned up, or that's part of the background. Okay, then there's a brief description of what a symposium is. After this, he said, when Socrates had reclined and dined with the rest, they made libations, sang a song to the god, and in Greek that always means, I'm not naming the god, but it's one of the gods, Apollo, Zeus. It would regularly be Zeus, right? And did all the rest of the customary rites. And Benedetti has a note on the customary rites, and then turned to drinking. So the word symposium describes that, right? And Plato has built into that occasion something that changed our understanding of what an appropriate evening entertainment is. Okay. Now that's when Pausanias speaks up and says, I'm extremely hungover and I need a rest from heavy drinking. Aristophanes backs him up. Eryximachus says, I just need to hear from Agathon, the person who owns the house, right? And Agathon also says he doesn't feel like drinking a lot. And so at 176C, Eryximachus says, we seem to be in luck. Myself, Aristodemus, Phaedrus, and those here. These are the unnamed people whose speeches occur after Phaedrus' speech, and we're not told what they are. And it's the only place where Aristodemus tells Apollodorus, who tells us that he passes over some speeches. So there's at least a couple of people whose speeches we don't hear. Okay, so if you who have the greatest capacity for drink have now given up, for we are always incapable. And he says, and I leave Socrates out of account, as he can go either way. He will be content with whatever we do. Now, so Eryximachus, having been given political permission, science, having been given political permission, then offers its advice, right? Drunkenness is medically a bad thing to do, blah, blah, blah. And so Phaedrus, and this will be helpful to understanding Phaedrus. This is the beginning of the second paragraph at 177D. Actually, no, it must be 177, it must be 176, but unfortunately, this PDF cuts off the numbers. I apologize for that. So, well, as for myself, he said, Phaedrus, the mere Renusian said, interrupting. So Phaedrus interrupts Eryximachus. Eryximachus is his lover, right? Phaedrus interrupts and says, I am used to obeying you, being persuaded by you, as in, for example, being involved in this relationship with you, particularly in whatever you say about medicine. Why? Because I'm particularly concerned about health and utility, okay? Not particularly erotic. This is Phaedrus. Okay? And now the rest will do so too if they take good counsel. And everyone agrees. And Eryximachus says at E, since then it has been decreed. And Benedetti, who has an extraordinary good grasp of Greek, is not over-translating, but he's bringing out a possibility in a Greek word that it just means doke, it seems, right? It seems to me. The first word of the dialogue is dokor, I seem, in my opinion. Right? But this word is also used in political decrees. So it seems good to the Athenians, doke, tois, athenaios, to make parking after 6 p.m. outside the library illegal. Right, so every law begins with it seems. It's the opinion of it's the conviction of the Athenians. Plato makes that doke, it's the conviction of the Athenians into opinion. So the whole political self-understanding is just the starting point for philosophical understanding. But you can't step outside that and say, like Descartes, I'm going to put aside all opinions, and I'm going to begin with an absolutely certain foundation, because Plato knows that if you do that, what you are going to do is surreptitiously make your supposedly firm starting point just another opinion, and your whole science will be built on this opinion, and therefore it will be very fragile, and you'll never be able to make that a certain foundation, which is why there's endless discussion about the foundations of mathematics and physics and blah blah blah. And that's why in the 20th century, when people were actually aware of this, there was an enormous crisis in physics. But, yeah, we've got enough other crises to bother us for the moment. Okay, so he says it's been decreed, and there's a little bit of legal language in the beginning of the dialogue, of which that's an example. Okay, so it's been decreed, or it seems good to us, that everyone is to drink as much as he wants to, and there's to be no compulsion. I next propose to dismiss the flute girl who just came in and let her flute for herself, or if she wants, for the woman within, while we consort with each other today through speeches. So speech replaces music and drink. Doesn't happen often in nightclubs that the lights come on, everyone's, well, let's discuss an important fundamental philosophical question and replace the drinking and the music. But yeah, that's what happened at this particular disco. Okay, and then he makes this proposal, and he says, another quote from a poet, but I didn't get the context because I was building more context than actual text. But here he quotes Euripides, and this is a quote that Plato uses on a few occasions. The beginning of speech, the story is not mine. The mythos, the story is not mine, but Phaedrus's. So I'm going to read a couple of sentences from 177a, about 3. On several occasions, Phaedrus has said to me in annoyance, "Isn't it awful, Eryximachus, that hymns and paeans have been made by the poets for other gods, but for Eros, who is so great and important to God, not one of the many poets, not one of them there have been ever made even a eulogy." And if you want, consider in their turn the good sophists. So we have two authorities for Phaedrus, poets and sophists. And he doesn't believe in the stories of the poets. That's very clear at the beginning of the Phaedrus, and it becomes clear at the beginning of his speech. He doesn't believe in them, but we only have writings. We don't have any contact with the first principles of things. In fact, they may not be the first principles of things. We just have writings about them. Okay. And if you want, consider in their turn the good sophists, and the word good is useful, Christos. And he uses it in his speech. That's the aim of things in his speech, what is useful. And I don't know how Benedetti you can translate it good. It's one of the 5 words for good in ancient Greek, but it's not the word for good, which is agathos, and its root meaning is from kraomai, which is to make use of something. Right? So the sophists are useful, and I take this to be the hint that they're solid. The poets, they're fantasists. They tell these myths about gods and so on. And he wants Eros praised. And why does he want Eros praised? But not because he's a particularly erotic person, but it benefits him as a beautiful young beloved that other people are erotically disposed. And for example, they can give him sound medical advice. So he gets what's useful by being beautiful. Utility is the measure. This is only hinted at, but it becomes more clear in his speech. So consider in their turn the useful sophists. They write up in prose praises of Heracles and others. So that's Hippias. Hippias wrote a work on the choice of Heracles. But he also wrote about musical instruments. And Hippias is one of these sophists who is at this dialogue called the Protagoras, and he's sitting with Eryximachus and Phaedrus. Okay, so they praise Heracles and others as the excellent Prodicus does. Prodicus is at the Protagoras in the company of Agathon and Pausanias. So these, sophistry and poetry are mingling in this dialogue and in the Protagoras. Okay. So, though you need not wonder at this, for I've even come across a volume of a wise man in which salt got a marvellous puff for its usefulness. And you might find many other things of the kind with eulogies. Okay, but Eros is being neglected. Now, Eros is not one of the gods of the city, like Zeus, Apollo, Hera, and so on. And so therefore doesn't have hymns to it. And that the reason for that is that people who are inspired by Eros tend to do things that are destructive of the standards of the city, the laws of the city. And in tragedy, there's quite a few songs or discussion. Well, yeah, they're usually part of either a choral hymn or they're not usually part of the prosaic discussion. But they're usually condemnations of Eros that makes human beings overreach and become hubristic, go beyond the nomoi, beyond the laws. So that's why Eros doesn't. But Eros is also associated with nature, not the law. Okay, so Eryximachus endorses this opinion of Phaedrus and proposes that everyone make the most beautiful praise of Eros that he can, beginning with Phaedrus. And at 177D, just before E, top of page 7, in the second paragraph, Socrates responds, "No one," Socrates says, "will cast a vote against you," as if he's proposed a vote before the assembly. This has this political cast that was brought out by that word before. "No one will cast a vote against you, Eryximachus, for I surely would not beg off, as I claim to have knowledge, expert knowledge of nothing but erotics," right? Which, on the face of it, is an unusual profession. And he makes this profession 3 times in the Platonic dialogues. So it's the only time that he ever says he has episteme, knowledge of anything, is knowledge of erotics. Now, if you get to his speech in the Symposium, his speech is about Eros as being the fundamental orientation of the human psyche, the fundamental longing. So his knowledge would be knowledge of our longing and our incompleteness, not the wisdom of what completes us. And that would be one way of understanding his knowledge of ignorance. He has a knowledge of what we lack, a knowledge of the various kinds of human psyche and what would fulfill them, but not not the wisdom that would fulfill that human longing. Okay, so that's Socrates who makes this claim. He has knowledge of nothing but erotics, nor would Agathon and Pausanias beg off. And why would they not beg off? Because they're lovers. Pausanias is the lover, Erastes, and Agathon is the eromenos, the beloved. To say nothing of Aristophanes, whose whole activity is devoted to Dionysus and Aphrodite. Now that's very ambiguous. So Aphrodite, ta aphrodisia, is, which means the things of Aphrodite, is the ancient Greek way of saying what we call sex. Right? And Dionysus, well, the god of wine. So that's associated, but not exactly the same as Eros. And none of the others I see here would refuse either. Okay, and then he makes this very humble remark that he and Agathon, who lie last in the circle of people from Phaedrus, will be at a disadvantage because everyone else will be able to say everything before they get there. And he makes a similar remarks when he begins to speak. Okay, and then that's the full introduction to the dialogue. And then at 178a, the beginning of the last full paragraph, it says, "First of all, as I say," this is Apollodorus, "he," that is Aristodemus, "said that Phaedrus began his speech at somewhat the following point." Right, so this is the beginning of the first speech. Was there anything anyone wanted to discuss before we get to the first speech? Just about any of the introductory passages, or happy to dive in?
I've got a thought, but
Yep.
I don't know that it might take us too far afield. But just thinking on the fly, you've talked a lot about how Socrates has this understanding of the desire, the perhaps insatiable desire that we have for knowledge that can't be filled by, let's say, any earthly good or just mere opinion. We have a desire for absolute truth. And I'm thinking about the other characters in the dialogue, Eric Symmachus, for instance, the doctor, is that right?
Yep.
And Agathon, the poet. And there's a sense in which both of those two characters are, in their professions, supposed to be oriented towards something outside themselves, truth and beauty, respectively. But there's this threat in the occupation of being a poet or the occupation of being a doctor, where the self becomes the object of worship, let's say, rather than the true or the beautiful with which you're in dialogue of a sort. So I just had a thought. I was wondering, is this point that you're talking about where Socrates understands that we have this desire for that kind of ultimate reality with which we're in dialogue? Does his understanding of that not being the sort of thing which can be filled by the self? It's not going to be Socrates himself or his fame or his glory or his standing amongst the Athenian community. It's not going to be that which is going to fulfill that desire. Is it his self-understanding there that sort of protects him from the possible sort of pathologies that you might see in other areas? And I would say you also see in philosophy as well today, where people mistake their own sort of intellectual acumen for that which they're sort of striving after. So that's a very general thought here, but I was wondering if that's kind of an overriding theme that you're setting up.
Yes, that's very good. I mean, that's a well articulated point. Yes. And so just to add a footnote, I take it from reading the Symposium that each of the figures except Socrates, and I'll come back to Socrates too, because he's not just praised by Plato. So, okay, let's say each of the figures, we have these 6 speeches on Eros, and so in a sense, everyone understands Eros. It's just part of human nature, like being able to speak. If for some reason you're inhibited from speech, you still have that potential, or you have the mental acuity that goes with speech or whatever. It's a part of human nature, like Eros. So everyone understands longing. But the 6 expressions of longing all contain, in precisely the way you discuss, an unintentional reflection of the limitations of how people are seeking to fulfill themselves, whether it's understanding the whole of everything through the science that works when it's healing the human body, but this is not a comprehensive understanding of things, or through the love of beauty. Like it works, but in the end it works to make him famous rather than good, right? And make his poetry spectacular rather than true. Yeah, so, and now there are 2 ways of looking at Socrates' speech. One is that he provides a more comprehensive understanding of Eros, within which you can see the poet, the lover, the doctor. You can see them as only partially attempting to fulfill themselves because of these self-contradictions and so on. And that his is the comprehensive one because it's only in philosophy, only in an openness to the truth, is there a non-contradictory way of life. Or is Socrates being criticized too? And do we see his limitations? And do we see the limitations of his orientation? So that's a question I leave open for the moment. But yeah. So at the beginning of Phaedrus' speech, at 178a, he begins by saying that Eros was a great and wondrous god, and wondrous among human beings as well as gods. and that this was so in many respects, and not least in the matter of his birth. Okay, so, yeah. Not least in his genesis, right? Because there's no birth before Eros. Right? We have generation, birth, through two people or two principles coming together and giving birth to gods. But we have, before that, there must be genesis, some kind of coming to be that's not erotic. Right? Whether or not he intends that's what comes out in his speech. Okay, he says, for the god to be ranked among the oldest is a mark of honor. Now, the Greek is a bit more emphatic. For that the god is the oldest. That's his emphatic statement. That the god, Eros, is the oldest, but it's not the oldest because there's something before. Right? But that the God is the oldest is a mark of honor, and here is the proof. The parents of Eros neither exist nor are they spoken of by anyone. So he did not come about by birth, right, and generation. The parents of Eros neither exist nor are they spoken of by anyone, whether prose author or poet. Right, so the poets are the public makers of the world that the people inhabit. The prose authors are the private people, and the word he uses here is idiotes, from which we get idiot, a private person, not a public person, right? But the private authors are the sophists. And this is what I meant last week by saying that science is a necessarily private activity in ancient Greece. And we had that qualification we discussed. But you could say the same for us now. The narrative is public, and science, and even science has to appear as part of the narrative. It can't come in as it is, because we're not all physiologists, mathematical physicists, and so on. What was the thing that we all became in 2020? Epidemiologists. That's right. I know I did. Okay, so public poets, private prose authors. So that's why I wouldn't translate that as birth, because he's just now saying he is the oldest. The proof that he's the oldest, he has no parents, so he somehow came to be, but wasn't born. Okay, and so that he starts with Hesiod, but Hesiod says that chaos came first, then thereafter broad-breasted earth, always the safe seat of all. And in Hesiod goes on to say, of all the immortal gods who hold Olympus and Tartarus. So in Hesiod, earth is the safe seat of the gods, and our cosmos is limited by Olympus, where the very, very few, like some of the heroes might get to go to the Isles of the Blessed or Olympus, and Tartarus, where people might be punished, like Tantalus, kind of like a hell, right? So there's a moral composition to the cosmos, which has been cosmane, or adorned by the poets. He takes all of that out, right? There's earth, and we all know what earth is. You can touch it, it's real, you can measure it. There are no gods, right? Okay, so after chaos, somehow there came to be, out of what? We don't know, earth and Eros. After chaos, he says there came to be these two, earth and Eros, and Parmenides says that Genesis, coming to be, first of all gods devised Eros, but devised Eros as the first of the gods. That's what the word order is slightly ambiguous, but in the Greek, it's Genesis coming to be somehow devised of the gods, Eros first. And then he says, Acusilaus agrees with Hesiod as well. Yeah, the text has been, because people think that Plato must have a better edition of Hesiod, they've changed the text around, but Benedetti has clearly changed it back to the original form, which is good. Okay, so there is an agreement in many sources that Eros is amongst the oldest, and as the oldest, We have him as the cause of the greatest goods. Right? The oldest is the cause of the greatest goods. Now, I just want to read you a line from R.G. Berry, again, another person who knows Greek exceptionally well, and he comments on this line. The participle gives the impression of a causal connection, as if beneficence must be in direct proportion to antiquity, exclamation mark. What an absurd idea. But that is the idea of every society. The old is the good, right? The founding fathers, the gods, the oldest is the good. But when you get back, if that means that the oldest is the good and it gives birth to a chain of causes down to we current mediocrities, then what brought into being those oldest authorities? That's an inherent problem with the identification of the old and the good. But the old is the good. That's every traditional society, right? Now, Descartes says at one point in one of his letters, he says, to philosophize is to innovate, to make new. And that's become our notion, right? The new is the good. Why? Because they're making progress. Towards what? Well, more progress. And faster progress, more efficient progress. Towards what? It's just progress. You can't argue with progress. Towards greater utility. And it's funny that Phaedrus is the spokesman for utility. But he has this traditional view, and this is a critique that Plato makes of the sophists, that they accept the identification of the old, therefore the oldest cosmological principle is the highest, which is the principle of the political society. Homer is the first poet, the greatest poet. He made the gods, and we worship Zeus, who is the father of all the other gods. But Zeus had a father who he castrated, right? So, and that's an internal problem in the poetry. I mean, Homer is wise enough to understand that and make the problem manifest. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to jump from the cosmological first principles of things to the human level. And one aspect of Phaedrus' speech is that it makes absolutely no sense. There's no way of relating the cosmological view to the human level. And I think that is Plato's position, which is worked out in other ways in different places. But if you have this view that Phaedrus holds, the cosmos is just this process of genesis without generation, that's later, then it will be a process of, it's not intelligible by itself. It doesn't have there's no principles in nature of the human things. There's no good or bad in a chaos of earth and night and so on. Right? And so there's no way of making the jump from the cosmological to the human. Okay, but we'll come back to that because that is a theme through the whole dialogue. There's a term, the gigantomachia, the battle of the giants, whereby the older cosmological gods have a war with the new Olympian gods in Hesiod and elsewhere. And the new Olympian gods win, and they are now our gods from the Greek point of view. And some of the sophists, when they want to disguise what they're doing, they refer back to the pre-Olympian gods as a way of saying, no, our materialism and so on is captured by that myth, not the current gods. But this comes up in the next few speeches in detail, as we'll see. Okay. He says, so the oldest is the cause of the greatest goods, for I can hardly point to a greater good for someone to have from youth onward than a good lover. Now, the word good is useful, right? I am not able to speak of a greater good. And this is, actually, he starts with good. There is no greater good for someone directly from when they're young than a useful lover. Okay? So the good is identified with the useful. And that's the main theme of Phaedrus' speech. Can you grab that? Thanks. Yeah. Dan, can you?
Just just on that passage there. So in this translation, we've got a greater good, and that's good.
That's
Then we
good.
get-
And then when he goes to the end of that clause and says, for someone to from youth onward, then a useful lover.
My question is, but there's no prospect of translating a greater utility. I can hardly point to a greater utility. So you see, in that original text, there's a different word for the first good and the second good,
Yeah.
and there's no way of saying that they're both being useful.
No,
No,
the first one is agathos,
Yeah,
which
thank
is
you.
like Agathon's name is the word for good.
Yes, yes.
Like in the Republic where they talk about the idea of the good, or that's agathon.
Yep.
Yeah.
I wasn't arguing. I was just trying to see whether there was any difference between those two words in the original, and of course there is.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So he starts with, what's the greatest good for a human being? Well, it's to have a useful lover, because utility is good. Because you're not in love, this person is, and they'll do things for you. They'll give you medical advice, for example, free medical advice for life. That's what Phaedrus currently has. And then the end of the sentence is, and for a lover, a beloved. He doesn't fill it out. He doesn't say that the greatest good for a lover is to have a useful beloved. That doesn't exist, right? And I mean, grammatically, he could have filled that out, and he should have filled it out, but he doesn't, because A, is no concern to him, and B, it doesn't make any sense. Because what the lover has is the promise. Have you heard of this? Is it Stendhal who says that beauty is the promise, meaning the not fulfilled promise of happiness. So yeah, the lover has the illusion of possibility of happiness in the beauty of the beloved. They're not getting something useful. As we'll see, they're the one who has to do things like die for the beloved, which is the opposite of useful. Okay, so next line. For that which should guide human beings who are going to live beautifully, fairly throughout their lives, can be implanted by neither blood ties, nor honours, nor wealth, nor anything else as beautifully as by love. Now that's... Okay, I'm just going to offer you an alternative. For that which it's necessary, that which must lead human beings through their whole life for those who are going to live beautifully. Now, beautifully in Greek, and this is an important word for the whole dialogue, because eros is normally for attraction, is normally of what's beautiful, human deeds, works of art. Right? The word for beauty in Greek is kalos, which means beauty or nobility. So a kind of independent splendor that a thing has, or a deed has, or a work has, beauty or nobility. So we have no single English word. So sometimes people will say fairly, finely, nobly, whatever, but beauty or nobility. Now, what does living beautifully or nobly mean? We're going to see. So that which ought to lead human beings. What does he say? Yeah, guide human beings. That's a little bit soft. Nothing else. So all of these public political things, your family and your dean, wealth and honours, implants, as well as a private passion, which is eros, which is necessarily private. Right? Yeah, you can only make it public by destroying what it means to be a human being. This is unfortunately what we're currently trying to do right now. Okay. And he says, so what do I mean by this? What do I mean is that which is most necessary that be implanted in human beings so that they can live nobly, right? He means shame before things that are shameful, and love of honor, ambition for the things that are beautiful, which could be things or people, right? So the lovers who are emulous, ambitious towards the people who they regard as beautiful, and feel shame towards what is shameful. Now, there's a disproportion here between what the lover experiences and the beloved experiences. And Phaedrus, as a beloved, I'm just cutting to the chase to make it a little bit, he's a beloved who is concerned with his own utility, and therefore he wants the noble lover who is prepared to sacrifice themselves for the beloved. We've actually gone on to, so we should have a break. Sorry. So yeah, let's come back in 10 minutes. Okay, so but first, any questions? Please speak now or interrupt as we go. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep churning through this figures of speech. So the most necessary thing that should lead someone who is going to live nobly or live beautifully is eros, but eros implants it like nothing else. Right? And what is that most necessary thing? It's shame before shameful things, and honourable ambition, which is at least nice explication of the word that means both of those things together. Honourable ambition in the face of beautiful things, or noble things. The word can mean both. Or it could be in before, or honourable ambition in the eyes of those people who are beautiful. It's ambiguous.
Martin,
Yes.
sorry, two things. One is your volume has got a bit of an echo.
Let me just see if I've got the right. Yeah, it should be the right microphone. Yeah, how's it now?
No, the same.
Yeah. This room does have a slight echo. I can hear it myself.
No, before it was very different. It was much better.
Okay.
I can still hear you. It's just the quality.
Yeah. I prefer to have it working properly. Is it still the same now as I'm speaking?
Still the same. What about other people who are listening?
Yeah, I've got the same problem. It is different. It's more echoey. It was better before the break.
Right.
Check the,
I've checked this. It's definitely this microphone that's going.
and the battery's fine?
And it's definitely on. And it definitely has power. And yeah, it hasn't changed the default back as sometimes it does. So let me just check one more set. Notice, yeah, that's the right set. Not sure what that is because I haven't changed anything. If it's too distracting, I could restart.
No, we can hear you. It's just anyway. But the second point I have is when you share the screen,
Yeah.
could you enlarge the page a bit?
Yeah.
Certainly, from my point of view, it'd be easier to follow you as you're talking.
Yeah. How's that?
That's better. That's even better.
Yeah, I can't point because it won't let me do that, but yeah, we're here. So he says, so I assert that in the case of any real man who loves, so a man who is in love, were it to come to light that he was either doing something shameful or putting up with it from another out of cowardice and without defending himself, he would not be as pained on being observed by either his father, his comrades, or anyone else as by his beloved. So the sense that what he's appealing to is that this is a private passion, eros, and necessarily private passion, which if you try to make it public, I think that it distorts it. But he is now making the case for the public utility of this private passion. And the power that the argument has, to the degree that it has any power, it's that private passion can overwhelm public standards, right? Or other public pressures. And that's what he's appealing to here. So that the private passion, which leads you to be ashamed before someone who you admire, can overcome other standards you might otherwise adhere to. So we observe that this same thing holds in the case of the beloved. He is exceptionally shamed before his lovers, right? So his language exposes the problem of this disproportion between lover and beloved. The lover has one beloved who they're ashamed before and emulous before. The beloved can have many lovers, like a Phaedrus, who gets medical advice from this person, free food from this person, and so on. And it's not as obvious that the beloved feels as acutely the sense of shame as the lover does. Not at all obvious. Okay, we observe the same thing in the beloved. He is exceptionally shamed before his lovers whenever he is seen to be involved in something shameful. So that puts all of the emphasis on visibility. It doesn't tell you how someone acts when they're not being looked at. And this is the problem with he's going to make shame and emulation the cause of excellent behaviour. But it's instrumental. You're not doing the thing because it's good. You're not defending yourself or defending someone else because you have the virtue of courage, but because you're ashamed not to do it. So you're doing the virtuous thing for the sake of something else. Okay. Now the translation is, so if there were any possibility, it's actually if there were any device, and that comes back in later in the speech and later in the dialogue. The word is mekaner, if there's a mechanism, if there's a device, by which a city or an army could be composed of lovers and beloveds, then there could be no better way for them to manage their own city, for they would abstain from all that is shameful, and be filled with love of honour before one another. Be filled with love of honour before one another is ambiguous, because it can mean be ambitious with one another, which just gives the implication that if there are many people who love one person and so on, there will be a fight. It does not lead to civic harmony. This is a hint, just a very small hint. He said, so from 179A1, besides, were they to do battle alongside one another? Yeah, it's very ambiguous in the Greek, deliberately so. If they were to fight with one another, that could be fight against one another because they're competing, right? That's the problem of making this passion the cause of excellence. But it also primarily means fight alongside one another. Then even a few of this sort will win over just about all human beings, which is a big claim. That the people driven by eros and therefore shame and emulation in the eyes of the beloved would beat everyone else. Benedict is translating this word that means man as a real man, and that's not bad because the word aner means emphatically a man, and the word kuner means emphatically a woman. The word anthropos means a human being, not particularly anyone important, just a human being. And here he is using this word that means a man. And because it's a patriarchal society, it can also be a word for citizen, because men participate in the assembly and women don't. Women do go to the theatre though. But anyway, for a real man in love would of course far less prefer to be seen by his beloved than by all the rest. So it's entirely a negative standard. You don't want to be seen doing something. It's not that you want to do something. You don't want to do the right thing, right? Now, by all the rest, when it comes to deserting his post or throwing away his weapons. Now, why would you desert your post or throw away your weapon? Because if utility is the standard, then the worst thing of all is death. So you're going to throw away your weapon and run away. That's, for Phaedrus, that would be the sensible thing to do. You want to not die, right? Then there's an end to all utility, to everything good. But lovers are impelled by being seen by their beloved to stay at their station. He would choose to be dead many times over before that happened. And to say nothing of leaving behind one's beloved or not coming to his aid when he is in danger, there is no one so bad, and the word is the opposite of good, like good and bad in English, but also excellent human being, base human being. Right? There is no one who is so base that once the god Eros has entered him, he would not be directed toward virtue to the point where he is like the one who is, it's not best by nature, I think, like the one who is best by nature. Yeah, it is. It's best by nature. So you have people who are by nature the best, by nature excellent, whatever that means. These people are not by nature excellent. Their eros has driven them, doesn't matter how base they are, to act as if when they're being looked at. Otherwise, maybe not. To the point where they are like one who is the best by nature. And it says simply, as Homer said, the strength that the god breathed into some of the heroes, Eros supplies from himself to lovers. So, and Homer has a couple of instances where Athena and Apollo breathe strength into a hero. So there's a divine source for their deeds. Whereas Eros is something within all people to some degree, and within the lovers especially, and it makes them act as if they're like the best by nature. Okay, and what is more, and then, okay, so that brings us, that's kind of a natural break, and that's why Benedict's made a paragraph break. There are no paragraphs breaks in the Greek. And then so we first discussed shame and ambition, then a device that would make an army or a city be well run and unbeatable, which is that it's composed of lovers. And that's what I meant by saying, this is an anticipation of the modern notion that instead of saying, well, these are the gods and those are the laws and these are the standards of excellence, you make a private passion the mainspring of public excellence, a selfish private passion. The beloved wants to be served by the lover wants to be well regarded by the beloved, and that becomes the mainspring of public excellence. Yeah.
Do we get to a point where there's a... Thank you. Do we get to a point where this notion of we leave this sort of status as binary between lover and beloved, and just where we introduce notions of mutuality?
Yes.
We do. Eventually. Thank you.
But we start with, because this is how it's understood by these people.
Yes.
We start with this. Probably the greatest degree of mutuality comes up in Aristophanes' speech.
Okay.
Because that's an essential part of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's very different from, in some sense, modern romantic, like post-Rousseau romanticism in Austen and Tolstoy and Sten Hall, where the key to love is its mutuality.
Yeah.
And the tension of all of those books is in the coming to a mutual love out of misunderstanding, miscommunication, doubt about what the other thinks, and so on. That's not the core of loving in this text.
Yes. Thank you.
But that's because these people, after Rousseau's direction, look, given that we start from selfish human passions, we are never going to have a genuine unity. between people. Everyone's going to be trying to rip each other off. If you start with the desire for selfish utility, you'll never have a genuine common good. And Rousseau says, well, Rousseau says, you're right, Hobbes, Locke, you're right. There is no genuine common good. But there is a genuine selfless love in the mother for the child. What we have to develop is the notion of romantic love between the man and woman who generate the child. And then we have an indirect attachment to the political whole through the family. And that's romanticism. It always ends in a marriage after going through these miscommunications and so on. That's post-Rousseauian romanticism. But that's the new core of there being a common good. So you have an indirect patriotism because the country supports your family life and so on. Okay, and so then the second line at the bottom of this page, 179b, he says, and this is the end of utility. Like if utility is the end, the worst thing is death, right? And what is more, lovers are the only ones who are willing to die for the sake of another, because otherwise you'd be an idiot. Like to die for your city or your gods doesn't make sense to Phaedrus. He's a utilitarian who doesn't believe in these old stories, right? So what could possibly bring you to die? The only possible sense it could be is if you die for your beloved. And so he says, lovers are the only ones who are willing to die for the sake of another. And then he gives three examples, Alcestis, and Orpheus, and Achilles. The first one is Alcestis. Now what's interesting is that he's been talking about lovers making the best fighters, and about unair, about unbred, real men, as Benedict translates it. But his first example is a woman. So he's compelled, since he's made the spring of excellence a human passion, he's compelled to broaden it to women as well. And so what is, okay, so, and that is not only true of real men, but of women. As well. So Alcestis, the daughter of Peleus, offers a sufficient testimony for the Greeks, on behalf of this argument. She alone was willing to die on behalf of her husband, though his father and mother were alive. So normally, fathers and mothers are expected to sacrifice themselves for the younger children. But through her love, she so much surpassed his parents in friendship that she showed them up as alien to their own son and only related to him in name. So for Phaedrus, this erotic relationship is superior to the genetic relationship, and to the political relationship, and to the relationship to one's gods. This is a natural basis for genuine common good, but only through eros. So her performance of this deed was thought to be so noble in the opinion, not only of human beings, but of the gods as well, that although there have been many who have accomplished many noble deeds, the gods have given to only a select number of them the prize, I don't know why Benedict says a guerdon, the prize of sending up their souls again from Hades, and hers they did send up in admiring delight at her deed. So the human being who admires the beauty of the beloved is admired by the gods for their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the beloved, and then rewarded. Now, if you're going to die for your beloved, then your reward is necessarily going to have to be brought back from Hades, made alive again, or it's going to have to be a reward after death. So the gods have come back in against Phaedrus' own will. He needs them to reward the lovers who will sacrifice their life for people like him. Yeah, so he says, so gods too hold in particular esteem the zeal and virtue that pertains to love. Yeah, the gods too, they honour. So the traditional thing, before this speech, the traditional thing is you honour the gods. and then perhaps they reward you. Whereas he is now saying that you honor the beloved, and then the gods honor you. The gods honor the human beings. The gods are almost for the sake of human beings, which would make perfect sense for believers. Okay, that's the first example, Alcestis, who was willing to die for her husband. Second example, negative example, Orpheus, the son of Aegeus, they sent back from Hades unfulfilled. And though they showed him a phantom of his wife, an image for whom he had come, they did not give her very self to him because it was thought he was soft. Right? Softness is associated with the poets in Agathon's speech in a good way, but as I read that passage from the Phaedrus, similarly, like the lyre player he was, so he's insulting the poets. So he quotes his authorities, poets and sophists, but he doesn't have that much respect for the poets because they talk about things that don't exist in his view. And had not, so because Orpheus had not dared to die for love like Alcestis, but contrived to go into Hades alive. Consequently, they imposed a punishment on him and made him die at the hands of women. So that's meant to be an insult. He dies at the hands of women, not in battle like a man, but he's just shown that his own understanding of excellence, as rooted in Eros, requires as much respect for women as for men in Alcestis. There's just a little tension in his speech. And they did not honor him as they had Achilles, the son of Thetis. Okay, so second example is Orpheus, the poet. The poet tries to get a device, a mechaner. So he thinks a device that made an army or a city of lovers would make them unbeatable and manage their affairs well. But the poet wants a device to get out of dying for the beloved. And Phaedrus, one doesn't like that. You have to be prepared to die for me. Right? That's what he wants, because that's useful for him. It seems. I think it could be argued. Okay, so now we come to the third example, which is Achilles. For Achilles, they sent away to the Isles of the Blessed, because though he had learned from his mother that he would be killed if he killed Hector, and that if he did not, he would return home and die in old age, still he dared to choose to come to the aid of his lover Patroclus. Now, this is a very unusual interpretation of come to the aid. Okay? The whole theme of the Iliad depends upon this circumstance, that Achilles is told, if you enter battle, if you stay and fight in Troy, you'll die young, and you'll have eternal glory. If you come home, you can live to a ripe old age in anonymity. Then his best friend, or in the way Phaedrus describes it, his lover, the one, and Achilles, he argues, is the beloved, as we'll see. Patroclus borrows Achilles' armor and goes off and is killed fighting the Trojans. By Hector. For some reason, that line from Morris about Hector being the first of the gang to die.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Achilles sees his own armor go off and get killed. It's like his self is being doubled. And because of that, he decides to stay and fight, because his other self is being killed. And when he kills Hector, Hector is wearing that armor. So in effect, this is funny imagery of Achilles killing himself. But anyway, so he dies. In the Odyssey, in the middle of the Odyssey, Odysseus goes to the underworld and meets Achilles, and Achilles said, to be alive, I would rather be a fetus. It's not a slave, it's like an indentured serf to a farmer poor farmer than be king of everyone in Hades. So as a shade, as a phantasm, he wishes he could make the other decision, just to go and live an anonymous life.
It's like the opposite of to reign in hell.
Sorry?
It's like the opposite of to reign in hell. To reign in hell. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Did you say Odysseus just goes to hell?
Sorry?
Did you say Odysseus?
Odysseus
Yeah.
in the Odyssey
Yeah.
passes through the underworld on the way home. Okay, so okay. And with his vengeance accomplished, so Achilles goes out, kills Hector to avenge Patroclus. He dared not only to die on his behalf, but to die after him who had died. So why is that remarkable? Well, it makes sense to die for the beloved who is still alive, because that's useful to the beloved. But it's not useful to die after they've died. It doesn't bring any utility to him. And utility is his standard. So this is even more remarkable. So he says, on this account, the gods were particularly impressed and gave him outstanding honors because he had made so much of his lover. So that's the principle for Phaedrus. Will you sacrifice yourself for your beloved? Because he's in that situation. So then he criticizes Aeschylus. Aeschylus talks nonsense in claiming that Achilles was in love with Patroclus rather than the other way around. For Achilles was far more beautiful, not only than Patroclus, but all the other heroes as well. And besides, he was unbearded, and thirdly, far younger than Patroclus, as Homer says. So if you haven't fully grown your first beard, you're more beautiful and you're younger, you must be the beloved, like me, right? And then you should be admired for that. Now, then there's this funny quirk in his understanding. Well, anyhow, though the gods really hold in very high esteem that virtue which concerns love. So this is the second time he's used an odd expression, the seriousness and virtue concerning eros. Right? And here, the virtue which concerns eros or love. So it's not virtue. Right? The virtue is this byproduct of this passion. Okay, so they wonder, admire, and confer benefits even more when the beloved has affection, philia, friendship, affection for the lover, than when the lover has it for the beloved. Does that make sense? He's used that word before. When he talked about Alcestis, he says at 179c1 that she surpassed so much her husband's parents in friendship through eros. So the excellence is the friendship, right? The affection, the being willing to die for someone through eros. Eros is the means, and that's why he used that term device. If we can make use of this device as a social glue. You know how there are some things you only talk about them when you no longer have them. So we continually talk about building resilience, which means you don't have it. We continually have centers of excellence, which means you no longer know what excellence is. And I was about to say something that may add some elements, but okay, so he so exceeds in friendship through eros. Yeah, so friendship is the actual virtue, but eros is the device. So he said, down almost the line before line 180b, he says, well, anyhow, though the gods really hold in very high esteem, so the gods esteem the humans, not the humans esteem the gods, right? That virtue which concerns love. They wonder, admire, and confer benefits even more when the beloved has affection for the lover than vice versa. So initially it looks like the lover is, quote, inspired, unquote. The lover has the word in Greek is has a enthusiasmos, have a God within, inspired. But that looks originally like the higher thing, they're willing to die. But now it looks the highest thing is the beloved who is willing to die for the lover just out of pure affection, not inspired by eros. So he says, a lover is a more divine thing for a beloved, for he has the God within him. This is the reason why they honoured Achilles more than Alcestis and sent him to the Isles of the Blessed. So it originally looks like the high thing is the person inspired by eros, but that's merely an instrument to their acting properly. Whereas in fact, the highest is the person who has no real utilitarian motive for their affection. So he's pushed beyond his own criteria of strict calculating utility to an admiration for someone who can act out of affection. And affection then becomes philia, friendship, affection, devotion. That becomes the something that's genuinely admired. And I think that's against his own intention. Now, against all precedent and tradition, we are actually going to get the end of the speech. So he says, so this is how I assert that Eros is the oldest. Okay, problem. There were things before him. How did they come to be, and what status do they have, higher or lower than what comes about with the advent of Eros? Eros is the oldest, most honourable, because oldest, he said before, and most competent of the gods with regard to the acquisition of virtue and happiness. So, yeah, competence. Yeah, the most authoritative, competent, yeah. So in itself it's not a virtue, but it leads to the acquisition of virtue and happiness. What's happiness? Having people die for you, or dying for someone and being sent to the Isles of the Blessed, by human beings both when living and dead. That's the last word of his speech, which is placed there emphatically by Plato to say that if the focus is upon utility, that's equivalent to not really living. So then Aristodemus comments on at the end of the speech, he said that Phaedrus made some such speech, and after Phaedrus there were some others that he scarcely could recall. He passed them over, it would be interesting to know what they were about, but we don't get told, and told of Pausanias' speech. And then we're going to discuss Pausanias next time. So any suggestions, questions about Phaedrus' speech?
Well, yeah, I mean, Phaedrus does seem to be kind of full of himself, and casting his own beautiful self-image across or into Eros and the very origin of the universe. But you've got to start somewhere, and as Socrates does say in the Phaedrus, in the dialogue, he praises Phaedrus for being the cause of so many speeches about Eros. But yeah, why is it that Phaedrus wants to talk about Eros in the first place? Like, why is the whole proposal his?
Well, in the dialogue with Phaedrus, as you know, he is, at the beginning of the dialogue, he's trying to memorize a speech by Lysias, directed to someone who is young and beautiful, i.e. Phaedrus, about why that person should give their favours to someone who is not in love with them, rather than in love with them. And the main argument is that people who are in love are not sensible. People who don't love you and just want to be with you, well, you can deal with that. You can. They're sensible. They won't. Lovers are jealous, and so they'll try to diminish you, so that you become more dependent on them, and so on and so forth. But the key point is that is that they're not in their right mind. so they're not sensible. So his orientation, he's extremely attracted to that. His orientation is utility and calculation for himself. Now, what's going to happen immediately is Pausanias is going to say, yeah, that's a nice beginning, but what you haven't done is divided eros into the good and the bad kind of eros. Because we all know there's a bad kind, people who exploit their beloved, and so on and so forth. Now that becomes a major theme in some of the later speeches, and Socrates tries to restore the unity to eros, that it's not, it doesn't have these two kinds. And he also restores, well, what Socrates does is try to make eros good for its own sake. But so does for Aristophanes, for the poets. So what happens? I'll just have to. So the original order was going to be Phaedrus, Pausanias, sitting next to him, and then Aristophanes was going to go next. He gets the hiccups and can't talk. But this is, so in this dialogue, we have the playwrights produce small plays. Agathon at the beginning says, okay, servants, slaves, I want you to pretend, he doesn't say pretend, act as if we are your guests. So he's saying act as if you're free. Free in the sense of generous. And serve us like that. And then he says, quick extra remark, not that I ever tell you what to do anyway. So this is completely unselfconscious. He has to lie to produce this little drama of here we are, free, and people and I am being served by you because I am so wonderful. Not because I have the whole state on my side, if you run away you'll be tortured. No. Right? So this is something about poetry that it cosmane, it adorns and makes beautiful things that are compulsory and harsh. And we get that in Agathon's speech. Beauty is the highest thing, we can adorn everything. Right? Now, he's putting on a little show, and that's why he's been waiting for Socrates, because he wants Socrates to be there for his whole show. For him, the evening is a kind of production. It's the same with Aristophanes. He makes himself as the hiccups, so that he can then say, okay, I can't speak. Eryximachus, you have to speak. And then Eryximachus gives this scientific discourse about the cosmos. All the whole time, he's following Eryximachus' advice of how to handle your hiccups. And he's gargling and sneezing and so on. He's undermining. But that's a deliberate attempt. That's a small Aristophanean comedy that he's produced for us in the middle of this dialogue. And the playwrights are continually acting like playwrights. But then in the new order, then Aristophanes speaks out of the original order, and then Agathon, and then Socrates. And so it puts the two poets with the philosopher against the beloved, the doctor, and Pausanias. And Pausanias, and this is a point that Leo Strauss makes in his commentary, that when you realize that, you see that the first three subordinate eros to something else. So we've seen that with Phaedrus. He subordinates eros to these personal and political goods. Right? It's the eros, the virtue concerning eros. It brings it about. It's not, it's not eros for its own sake. The lover doesn't get anything for their own sake. They get to die. And Pausanias similarly pretends that eros the good eros has the effect of producing civic excellence, civic virtue, ethical virtue. And Eryximachus is for the sake of science, of his science medicine. I've now gone over time, I apologize.